Hi, we are Sam and Pablo, and we are the leading authors of the paper Bactrocera dorsalis in the Indian Ocean, A Tale of Two Invasions. In this research we focus on Bactrocera dorsalis, or the Oriental fruit fly, which is a highly detrimental fruit fly pest species, and it affects a lot of fruit farmers and the fruit trade in general. This species originates in Southeast Asia, but was able to spread to more regions worldwide. For instance, larger parts of Asia, India, China, for instance. It has also been recorded in Africa, and it has been able to spread up to South Africa. Even in Europe, it was detected and intercepted in Italy and in France. We focus on the Indian Ocean region because in this region the fruit fly occurs even after some eradication events, and we don't have a quite a good understanding about where the fruit fly came from and how it spreads throughout the region. And in this work we use molecular tools to retrace the steps of the Oriental fruit fly in the Indian Ocean region and learn more about its invasion history. So the main contributor to the spread of Bactrocera dorsalis is most definitely the international fruit trade. Fruits get transported all around the globe because of the globalized world we live in, and along with the fruits we have small hitchhikers, the larvae of these fruit flies, that tag along, and they get transported to a variety of different regions. So in general, when you have small passengers in the form of insects or other animals, they do not survive because they cannot cope with the new environment, and even if they can cope with the new environment, they might not be able to reproduce and form a stable population or spread in the new region of introduction. But in the case of Bactrocera dorsalis, it seems that it can very well cope with new environments. It has a high adaptability, and it can even reproduce and spread, and so it can be categorized as an exotic and invasive species. Think of, for instance, the house sparrows in Australia or Californian king snakes in Gran Canaria. These are all examples of invasives that are able to reproduce and successfully invade new territories. We know that for the case of Bactrocera dorsalis, fruit trade is very important because of the infected fruits, and these large-scale fruit transports are the main driver, as I mentioned, but we cannot forget that there's also a small portion of fruit flies that get carried around through private transports, small-scale transport, and these are most likely also very important in tackling the problem of fruit fly invasives.
And another important aspect is that many fruit flies are no picky eaters. For example, Bactrocera dorsalis can survive on more than 300 host species.
So to have an insight on the relationships between the populations of Bactrocera dorsalis in the Indian Ocean, we have sampled numerous individuals belonging to every population within the region, and then we have sequenced their genome. And the genome is essentially a sequence of bases, so we have 4 bases, A, T, G, C, and the more similar this sequence is compared between individuals and populations, the more related these individuals or populations are. And this gives us a good inference on the demographic history. So similar genomes translate into similar demographic histories of these populations and individuals. And throughout time, there's an accumulation of mutations. And mutations, they can arise in a specific region and get passed on to next generations. So these mutations, they can give us a specific information on the demographic history and origin of a certain individual when we sequence the genome of an individual and populations.
And additionally, we can also look at the diversity, the genetic diversity within populations. And for instance, newly founded populations, they often have a lower genetic diversity due to a demographic bottleneck, and this causes the new population to be represented by only a fraction of the original genetic diversity. And this is also a pattern that can help us in reconstructing the genetic, the invasion history. We inferred two invasion routes, one going from the East African mainland eastward to the Western Indian Ocean islands, and another one coming from Asia going towards Reunion and Mauritius. The eastward invasion has happened by island hopping, where the intermediate islands serve as stepping stones for the population to reach the most remote islands. And these events of island hopping, they have made a signature in the genetics of the invasive populations. For instance, the most remote populations are generally more genetically impoverished due to the bottlenecks that occur at each island hopping event. So we found two main invasion routes, but this does not mean that secondary invasion events have occurred, such as an introduction event going in the other direction than the main invasion direction, but this is masked by the most dominant signature, so this is something we cannot really detect in our data.
Yeah, and it's also worth mentioning that we have parallel evidence for this island hopping behavior of the fly in the form of historical records of interceptions of the fly. So this is always very good in research to have parallel lines of evidence that both show the same thing, because then you can make a stronger case.
As a conclusion, we'd like to say that whole genome sequencing generates an incredible amount of data that can be used to reconstruct biological invasion histories. Our results in particular highlight that the pest can spread from many directions, and more effective control measures are needed to prevent the further spread. The Indian Ocean is a region where many parts of the world overlap. For instance, there are many links with the African mainland, and social cultural ties are present with many Asian countries. And lastly, the island of Reunion, which is part of France, makes a link to Europe. And it is important to control this region, because this highly connected region can form a stepping stone in the global invasion of the species. Two distinct genetic clusters are present in the island group, and even though the species is now common, and hybridization between the two genotypes should be avoided, because we don't know if these mixed breed individuals might have additional traits that make the species more harmful.
Yeah, that's right. And also our data also provides some information for policymakers and border control, and can better inform them in terms of allocation of budgets and effort to control borders. We provide this information, so this is also a good and relevant output of our research, I think.
Yeah. We'd like to thank you for watching, and we hope that you've now learned more about biological invasions and how molecular tools can be used to have a better understanding